I played around roughly 10 hours of Kunitsu-Gami Path of the Goddess, and I honestly don't know how to feel about it. I believe that if you're into strategy titles and you want to play a game that allows you to be front and center in the action, I think that you should give this a try. I think this is a game that the tower defense crowd will probably enjoy. But before you do, I need you to understand that the game can take a bit to get going and that there are some really noticeable flaws as you start to progress through the later stages. Let me explain. The opening stages of Kunitsu-Gami essentially act as a tutorial, and there's a lot to take in. You'll learn how to purge defilement, which will grant you crystals to deploy units. You'll get to learn how to rescue villagers and then turn them into combat units. You'll also get to learn their strengths and weaknesses and how they should be utilized effectively, and you'll also learn that some of these villagers can only be turned into specific units. It's really interesting. You're going to learn where the Torii gates are and the time it takes for Yoshiro, who you'll need to protect, to get to that gate so that they can be purified. Most stages require multiple days to clear. Yoshiro moves very slowly and for a good reason, but you're going to know when they stop, so you can use that information to your advantage, because there are going to be certain areas that Yoshiro will sit there and have a large AoE protection cone instead of like the very small one that they normally have, which will usually get them in trouble. But if they have that big cone, they can do a lot of outward damage and protection, and you can also get better heals. The first few stages of this game are so simple that you can practically throw strategy out the window. Station your units near Yoshiro and then attack the gate. The problem here is that these opening stages give you a false sense of security. In fact, you might be bored because of how long it takes for enemies to spawn out of the Torii gate. Don't worry, because the game does scale as you continue to progress down the mountain, so there are areas that will challenge you. Eventually, you're going to be introduced to multi-tiered stages, and in my opinion, this is where the game really starts to hit its stride and starts to flow a little bit. These require you to utilize strategy, as the enemy will double in strength, and almost every level will feature a new enemy type for you to fight. If you aren't paying attention to where the enemies are spawning, you might find yourself surrounded, and there are those that can end up doing devastating damage to your squad. One of the most annoying enemies in the game will curse your character, and this will remove your ability to view deployed units and heal. When these enemies were introduced, this is where I started to believe that this game was going to just hit the ground running and really force the player to dig in and think. I also really enjoy the stages that require the player to make choices as to what route they'll take. While they only boil down to left and right, some areas are more defensible than others, but they can be costly in terms of crystals, which is the cost to clear a path for Yoshiro. In the multi-tiered stages, you need to be fairly snappy with your decisions. What traps or defenses will you build? Are you thoroughly exploring to rescue villagers or purge defilement? Do you have time to break down rubble or build bridges to access hidden areas? You only have so much time before you have to fight, and you'll need to keep track of your unit's health, so you really can't get greedy. Once you have successfully completed a stage, you'll be able to return to that area and rebuild. The base building aspect is simple. You direct the rescued villagers in rebuilding their village, and any task you assign to them will take at least the completion of the next stage before it is completed. Sometimes it will take 2 stage completions, but for the most part, it's usually 1. You are rewarded for your efforts, and if you don't want to waste time, I recommend directing the villagers to complete tasks that will net you Masubi, that will help you upgrade your units and eventually your character. Now, it's around 3 to 4 hours in before you reach a point where your character can actually be upgraded. And here is where you'll find a variety of things, such as the bow. And thank goodness you can unlock the bow, because flying targets in this game are a menace, because they can fly down and stun units, and they do it so easily too. It's very frustrating if you don't have marksmen, or if you don't have the capability to jump up and attack them, because they can be pretty easy to miss. So when you finally get the bow, I really kind of breathed a sigh of relief. There are also certain abilities like the perfect guard that are required to face certain enemies, because if you're just guarding against them, they can break down your posture, and if you take a direct hit from these enemies, it will melt your health bar. Being able to perfectly deflect them to punish them is fantastic. You can also upgrade to where you're granted more talisman slots for your Super Guard, which are your special abilities, and your Mazo amulet, which will grant you a variety of buffs for your character and your units. Now, I believe that everything works as intended in Kunitsu-Gami. While I don't think there is as much depth in terms of strategy, because the moment you start to unlock advanced units, you're breezing through certain levels without any issues. The problem that prevents this game from elevating itself lies in 3 places: the tedium of the base building, the boss fights, and when the game starts to introduce new objectives. With the base building, you have to manage every area, and while these areas can be completed rather quickly, it becomes very tedious when you have to constantly go back and forth to visit. You have to find tasks for the villagers to complete, find resources at times to help the villagers complete these tasks, and then go to each task to complete them. Doing this once or twice is fine. You probably won't think anything of it. Doing this 10 times can be draining. Your character movement is slow in general, and while I didn't really notice it early on because I was in a stage and I was like, it's not a big deal. When I'm back at a base and I have to run across the map to complete a task, your movement speed becomes very noticeable, and these sections can become very boring quickly. After a base is complete, you return to Yoshiro's tent to get a reward, and the completion of these bases is worth it. But the fact that you have to physically go to each task, it's just too much. The tedium of the base building can really interrupt the flow of gameplay, and even though I think it's cool that you can rebuild these areas, some of the tasks are too spread out and require you to navigate different obstacles to get through. It's just not fun after the first few times. So when it comes to the boss fights in this game, I would describe them as hit or miss. And I'm really trying to be nice when I say miss. The first few do a really good job of teaching the player the importance of working together as a team, but when it's early, you're going to notice that your character can practically solo every fight because you are really capable. The thing is, this game wants you to utilize certain talisman and units to optimize these fights, but you're only going to know this once you complete the fight and you get to that completion screen and it states, this can be done in under a minute. That's great, but these fights are more frustrating than fun, and I honestly didn't want to retry any of them. Your primary objective is trying to break down the boss's posture, and this can be done by either utilizing your Suba ability or hitting weak spots. Most bosses are pushovers, but there are those in which your units aren't effective when it comes to targeting, and it feels like they're swinging wildly and not doing anything. I encountered a few fights where I was waiting for some contribution from an individual unit, and they ended up just being fodder. And I mean that. They ended up just getting absolutely massacred. So what I did was I used that boss's aggro against them to beat them down, and then I moved on. There was one boss where I had to strategically place units to hit weak spots, but this one was somewhat confusing because as I was hitting a tendril that came out of the ground, I had noticed that no damage was being done, even though there was damage prior to that being done. And after a while, I had noticed that the weak spots that my marksmen were trying to target were being covered. So they couldn't hit that, and that tendril wasn't taking damage, so this fight ended up taking a bit to complete. I then just kept shooting at the tendril with my arrows in the hopes that something would happen, because I really started to get bored during this fight. It was really easy to dodge this enemy. It ended up knocking its posture down for the killing blow. I really don't know how it happened. I just kind of hit it with a charge shot and it fell down. But that fight had no flow to it, and there are a number of bosses that do that. And it's a shame because their designs are fantastic. I got really excited during some of these fights because I really feel like the developers got to flex their art, and it's a shame that most of these fights can be brute forced because they look so cool. The arenas you fight in, though, are pretty basic, which is kind of disappointing. But in these fights, you're supposed to protect Yoshiro because their death is a game over. So when they want you to optimize it, it's kind of strange that they're asking you to do that because they know that some of these bosses have these large AoE attacks that can damage Yoshiro from the opposite end. And they want you to get your units involved, which is cool, but the boss damage output is so high that they're getting shredded like tissue paper. I really feel like the boss fights overall were a missed opportunity, and even though some units fared better than others, it really felt like soloing was just more fun. Now, when it comes to the objectives found here in Kunitsu-Gami, it's generally going from point A to point B, and that is it. That's how the multi-tiered stages go to. You're just hitting Torii Gate and then another Torii Gate. So let's say point A to point B to point B to point C, whatever. But that's it, and that's completely cool. I was completely fine with it, even the Poison Swamp level, which was a massive pain in the ass to navigate. I completed that with barely anyone alive, but I had a good time in that stage in comparison to when the game started to introduce different objectives, such as protecting Yoshiro solo or trying to revive them utilizing crystals from enemies. You're going to notice that when that happens, the game's core mechanics don't really hold up and the game starts to falter. The first time you get introduced to a new objective, it has this really cool cutscene attached to it. Your character turns into a spirit. The only thing you can do during this time is direct your units. I can best describe Kunitsu-Gami as a tower defense game. Your units will cover an area, and if an enemy moves within that space, the individual there will react and then return once the enemy has been defeated. It's very basic, and while the strategy mostly happens in the prep phase, the time it takes for this section to be completed was far too long. Yoshiro required a lot of crystals, and while enemies weren't too threatening, certain elites were really spongy, and it felt like they weren't dropping enough resources, so this stage can feel really long. Luckily, I didn't run into a stage like this for quite some time, but when I did, it still wasn't great. And the thing is, even with new units, new enemy types, a mini boss, things that should keep you entertained, the fact that I could not actively participate with my character, it really felt like you took a core element from the game and it just didn't feel right. It just didn't feel entertaining. And also, using 2,000 crystals to revive Yoshiro took a long ass time. The thing is, when you are actively participating in this game, when you have direct control, this game feels really good. When you get that taken away, for example, when you are on stage where there's water and you have to just kind of sit on a boat, place your units, and then go from ship to ship, slicing down enemies. That type of stuff is okay, but it's really noticeable how easy it is. And because your units at this point are so capable, you're going to be sitting for quite some time before phases roll in. And it takes so long for this to occur that you're going to get bored. And they can feel really long when you're not directly participating, when you're just kind of sitting there and just letting everyone do their thing. There was one stage where I had direct control, and this was one of those moments where the game just kind of took away a core mechanic, so you didn't have any units to control. You were just guiding Yoshiro to the Torii Gate. So because you were doing it without any help, you'd probably say to yourself, well, I'm setting up all these traps and this should be pretty fun to see how I strategize this. The thing is, it takes a long time before the actual section occurs where you're starting to defend. So you have more than enough time to kind of get up all your defenses. And what you're going to learn is that some of these enemies will just navigate around traps. And then you are forced to fight in multiple directions. And you're going to be fighting a number of elites. And this can be really difficult without any assistance. The game expects you at this point to have the perfect guard unlocked, because parrying and counterattacking can do good posture damage, but you're not really required to unlock it. I was more focused on upgrading my units, and while I had the perfect guard unlocked, it's not effective without the actual counterattack. That's also another flaw of this game, by the way, is that you're still allowed to play the way you want. It's very clear, though, that the developers want you to utilize certain abilities and talisman to ensure that you have an optimal run. But just like the boss fights, you're not going to know that until you complete a stage, and then you'll see the optional objectives. I don't know why they aren't shown up front. I think that's just weird oversight, but I understand that if you want the player to learn, but if they complete that stage, then you show them that, and it's like, why would I want to go through 10 to 15 minutes of a stage again because you didn't want to give me the optional objectives up front? Some of these levels, if I'm being honest, aren't great, and trying to navigate solo with Yoshiro is not what I considered fun. I will say though that the boss fight that preceded it was pretty cool. With all this being said, Kunitsu-Gami is a game that can be enjoyable, but it really depends on your tolerance. I like to think that this game has decent polish, but there were times where I was kind of frustrated when certain things wouldn't work, where I felt like some of the interfaces were just a little bit too messy. I really do not like when you're trying to equip a certain talisman, especially the Mazo, and the menus there just suck. I do not understand why it's not categorized better. It's done in a way that is kind of frustrating to look at. And while you can favorite stuff, I want to be able to kind of like look at everything in a boxed view. I don't know why you want to just kind of put it in a scroll. It just does not feel good to navigate. Very odd. I can see people really liking this game, and I can see others dismissing it right after the first few stages, and I can honestly understand both points of view. I went through the first couple hours of this game saying to myself, I'm probably going to have a very negative opinion about it, and then I got to the point where I could upgrade my character and I went, you know what? This game's pretty cool. But then I started to hit certain stages and I realized that the experience was uneven when they went away from the primary objective of just going from point A to point B. That's where I think this game really shines. It's simple, but it's really effective because you do have direct control of your character, and sometimes you can kind of get your units involved and they can be really effective and dangerous. It's really cool just kind of throwing the sumo at people. I really like that because they act as like this really big aggro character, but they can also do really good damage. Every unit serves a purpose. I think it's really well done. I feel like every so often, Capcom will introduce a new game, and I feel that some of these games will be fairly ambitious in their direction, and I really feel like Kunitsu-Gami is one of those games. But the core mechanics found here can only go so far. And when you get to these later stages, you're going to notice that things do feel a bit repetitive. They do feel a bit stale because you can't really do much outside of maybe changing it up a bit with your units. But if you're super effective with what you have, maybe you just want to stick with it. I feel like there are a lot of good ideas here, but only some are executed well. But let me know what you think. Have you seen Kunitsu-Gami on Game Pass? Were you wondering about it? Have you thought about giving it a shot? If you have, how's your time with the game? Let me know in the comments. Because that's going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.